It was the kind of moment no one ever expected to see play out in the world's most scrutinized monarchy. The cameras clicked, the courtroom held its collective breath, and the world watched as the man once hailed as the people's prince stood before a judge, his face pale, his hands clenched, his jaw tight with disbelief. Prince Harry, the very figure who once embodied resilience and courage, who had carried the torch for wounded veterans across continents, was now standing trial not as a hero, but as a man accused of betraying those he claimed to fight for. And the sentence, when it finally fell, would not just shatter the gilded walls of the royal family. It would send ripples across the globe, shaking the very idea of what it means to trust in symbols, in legacy, in the people we thought we knew. The world had been primed for scandal where Harry and Meghan were concerned. From the moment the Duke and Duchess of Sussex stepped away from royal duties, every headline seemed to carry with it an undercurrent of suspicion, betrayal, or spectacle. But even in the most fevered imaginations of critics and commentators, few could have foreseen what would ultimately unfold. It wasn't simply a story about broken royal protocol or defiance against the crown. It was about money, millions of dollars meant for the Invictus Games, money intended to help wounded veterans rebuild shattered lives, money entrusted to an institution created out of sacrifice and hope. And investigators alleged that this money had instead been siphoned off, redirected through a web of offshore shell companies, some traced to contacts tied to Meghan Markle herself. It wasn't just financial mismanagement. It was betrayal in its purest form, a betrayal that would see Harry's name dragged through the courts, his reputation dismembered piece by piece, and his freedom stripped away in the most shocking way imaginable. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But how did we get here? How does a prince celebrated on battlefields, a man who wore the scars of war with pride, become the face of a scandal that left wounded veterans in despair? To understand the weight of this fall, one must step back into the beginning of Harry's story. The soldier who turned grief into purpose, the man who gave the world Invictus as a symbol of light. And yet, like so many tragic tales, somewhere along the way the story twisted. The Invictus Games grew from a noble cause into a sprawling empire of sponsorships, deals, and international acclaim. With that success came money, and with money came temptation. Slowly, whispers turned into questions, questions into investigations, and investigations into a storm so large it would consume him entirely. The trial itself was unlike anything the world had seen before. Royals had faced scandals, yes. Royals had been divorced, disgraced, and even abdicated. But a life sentence in prison? That was uncharted territory. The prosecution painted a devastating picture. Millions of dollars funneled through cleverly disguised accounts, redirected to companies with no real offices, no real staff. Only paper trails leading back to individuals with connections to Meghan. The defense tried to argue Harry's ignorance, that he was a soldier and a public figure, not a financial mastermind. But the optics were merciless. Veterans came forward with testimony of promises unkept, of programs underfunded, of their trust shattered. And for the public, those voices were louder than any legal argument Meghan or Harry's team could muster. What made this story so gripping was not just the numbers, not just the fraud. It was the human cost. Veterans who had lost limbs and livelihoods were suddenly being told the funds meant to support them had vanished. Families of fallen soldiers were left with nothing but disillusionment. And at the center of it all was the prince who had once been their greatest advocate. The betrayal was visceral. For many, it felt like a dagger from someone they had once believed would never turn his back. For others, it confirmed their long-held suspicions that Harry and Meghan's ventures were less about service and more about profit, less about duty and more about self-preservation. Still, even as the case unfolded, a haunting question remained. Was Harry truly the architect of this downfall, or was he ensnared by forces he didn't fully understand? Was Meghan the mastermind, as some prosecutors implied, using her connections and Hollywood acumen to build a web of financial channels too complex for Harry to unravel? Or was Harry complicit, aware enough to enjoy the luxuries while veterans struggled in silence? The courtroom could only answer in terms of evidence and sentencing, but for the public, the emotional debate raged on. Was this a tragedy of manipulation or a cold betrayal from the man himself? The introduction of Meghan into this saga could not be ignored. To many, she was either the villain of the piece or the scapegoat for centuries-old prejudices against outsiders in the royal family. Her connections to Hollywood, her understanding of branding and business, her ambition, all of these traits became weapons in the courtroom narrative. Shell companies linked back to people in her circles, transactions that carried her name or her associations, suddenly became the centerpiece of the scandal. And yet, Meghan remained elusive, maintaining her innocence, claiming she was as blindsided as anyone else. The dichotomy was stark. Either she was the orchestrator of the fraud, or she was another victim of a system collapsing under the weight of greed and incompetence. Meanwhile, Harry's image, once the cheeky young prince, the soldier who walked among his comrades in Afghanistan, the man who reached into the pain of wounded warriors to give them hope, was dissolving before the world's eyes. His speeches about resilience now seemed hollow. His promises of support echoed back with irony. Every headline twisted the knife further. The man who once embodied Invictus, meaning unconquered, now seemed more defeated than ever. And as the gavel struck, sentencing him to life behind bars, the symbolism was unbearable. The unconquered prince conquered not by war, but by scandal, betrayal, and the consequences of choices he could never escape. For the royal family, the fallout was just as severe. King Charles, already navigating public scrutiny over his reign, faced an unprecedented crisis. William and Kate, symbols of steadiness, were thrust into the spotlight with the impossible task of reassuring a shaken monarchy. And the public, watching from afar, could not help but ask, if this is what one prince has done, what does it say about the institution as a whole? Was this a personal failing or the inevitable result of privilege, wealth, and distance from accountability? Yet, as with all stories of power and downfall, there remained threads of doubt, of questions unanswered. Were all the facts really revealed? Did Meghan's alleged connections to the shell companies tell the whole story, or were there deeper forces at play? Could Harry have been both guilty and a victim at the same time? Guilty of negligence, perhaps, but not of the malicious intent painted by prosecutors? These questions lingered long after the courtroom emptied, after the headlines began to fade, after the shock settled into uneasy silence. This story is not just about one man's fall from grace. It is about the fragility of trust, the danger of unchecked ambition, and the devastating cost when those entrusted with hope turn it into currency. It is about veterans whose faith in a hero was broken, about a monarchy further fractured by scandal, and about a world struggling to reconcile the image of a beloved prince with the reality of a convicted fraudster. It is about love and betrayal, loyalty and greed, power and downfall. And by the time we reach the end of this journey, you will not only understand how Harry reached this point, you will feel the weight of every decision, every whispered secret, every damning revelation that led to the moment when the prince who once symbolized honor was sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind prison walls. Long before headlines of fraud, betrayal, and courtroom drama consumed his name, Prince Harry was known as the People's Prince. He was the boy who walked behind his mother's coffin, his face etched with grief the world could never forget, and who later grew into the soldier who seemed determined to carve out his own legacy outside the gilded palace walls. To understand the gravity of his downfall, one has to first understand the scale of his rise, the way Harry captured hearts not through polished speeches or flawless decorum, but through a rough-edged authenticity that set him apart from the rest of the royal machine. Harry's early years were defined by tragedy and scrutiny in equal measure. From the very beginning, the world had its eyes on him, not as a future king, but as the spare, the boy destined to live in the shadow of his brother, William. But where others might have faded into irrelevance, Harry's every misstep and every victory became amplified, dissected by tabloids hungry to paint him either as the lovable rogue or the reckless royal. What gave him staying power was that he was relatable in ways other royals never were. He made mistakes. He partied. He stumbled. Yet beneath it all, there was a sincerity that reminded people of Diana, the mother who had always put humanity before hierarchy. The turning point for Harry's public image came not in the palaces of London, but in the dusty, dangerous fields of Afghanistan. Unlike many royals who confined themselves to ceremonial uniforms and parades, Harry chose the front lines. In 2007, when he was deployed, the press coverage was electric. Here was a prince not content with waving from balconies, but flying Apache helicopters and eating rations alongside ordinary soldiers. For the men and women who served with him, Harry was not a distant royal. He was one of them. Soldiers told stories of Harry cracking jokes in the trenches, taking risks he didn't need to take, and insisting on being treated like everyone else. It was the kind of authenticity that money and privilege could never fake. Out of that experience came something that would define him for years to come, a bond with wounded veterans that went deeper than headlines. Harry had seen firsthand the cost of war, not just in death, but in the quiet devastation of those who came home broken. Missing limbs, haunted eyes, silent battles that raged long after the battlefield was left behind. For Harry, these weren't statistics. They were people he had shared his life with, people who had trusted him, laughed with him, fought beside him. That connection became the seed of something far bigger, the Invictus Games. The name itself carried a power. Invictus, meaning unconquered, was not just a brand, it was a promise. A global sporting event for wounded, injured, and sick servicemen and women. It became a stage where broken bodies could showcase unbreakable spirits. From the very first games in 2014, the atmosphere was electric. Crowds wept and cheered as men and women who had been written off as disabled proved they were anything but. Wheelchair basketball, cycling, rowing. Each event told a story of defiance, of resilience, of humanity refusing to be defeated. And at the center of it all was Harry, walking with veterans, hugging them, cheering them on with a passion that felt raw and real. This was Harry at his peak, the version of him the world fell in love with. The soldier who had become the champion of the wounded. The prince who didn't just talk about service, but lived it. For veterans, he wasn't just a royal patron. He was family. Men who had lost limbs said Harry made them feel whole again. Women who had struggled with invisible scars said he gave them a platform to be seen. Families who had endured sleepless nights found hope in the spectacle of Invictus. What made it so powerful was the contrast. In a world where royals often seemed out of touch, Harry was down in the mud, sweat on his brow, tears in his eyes, arms wrapped around the broken. He wasn't polished, and that was the point. He was real. And for a while, it seemed as though Invictus wasn't just a sporting event. It was Harry's redemption, his legacy, the proof that he had taken the pain of his childhood and turned it into something good. The games grew rapidly, expanding from London to Orlando, to Toronto, to Sydney, each one bigger, flashier, more international than the last. Governments pledged millions. Sponsors lined up, eager to attach their brands to the glow of heroism and resilience. Celebrities lent their names, Hollywood stars appeared in the stands, and media coverage transformed Invictus into a global phenomenon. It was no longer just about veterans. It was about optics, branding, influence. And while the spotlight on veterans remained central, there was no denying that Harry's star shone just as brightly. He had gone from the troubled prince to a global humanitarian icon. But even as the world applauded, some began to wonder, was the game still about the veterans, or had it become about Harry himself? Every event showcased his speeches, his handshakes, his hugs. His face was on the posters, his name in the headlines. The more Invictus grew, the more it seemed to orbit around him. For some, that was not a problem. After all, his fame was what attracted the money and attention. But for others, it was the first whisper of a dangerous shift. When money and fame mix with altruism, the line between service and self-interest becomes dangerously thin. Still, in these early years, suspicion was muted. Harry's sincerity was unquestioned by most, and the money, at least outwardly, was flowing to good causes. Veterans were being flown to international events, rehabilitation programs were being funded, families were receiving support. The games were delivering on their promise, and the prince who had once been dismissed as a spare was now carving out a role far beyond royal expectation. He was not William's shadow anymore. He was his own man, with his own global mission. Yet, with success came complexity. The games were no longer a small charity event. They were a multi-million-dollar enterprise with sponsors, broadcasters, and politicians all demanding a slice of influence. Deals were struck, contracts signed, and somewhere in that growing machinery of money and ambition, the purity of the original idea began to blur. Harry, once just a soldier among soldiers, now found himself navigating boardrooms, legal contracts, and financial decisions far removed from the dusty fields of Afghanistan. For a man whose strength had always been his humanity, not his management skills, this was treacherous terrain. But for the world, none of that was visible yet. What they saw was the golden image: Harry the soldier prince, Harry the champion of veterans, Harry the man who had risen from tragedy to build something beautiful. The games became his shield, deflecting criticism of his past scandals, his wild youth, even his tense relationship with the press. Invictus wasn't just his project, it was his redemption arc. And for many years, it worked. Looking back, it is this period, this rise of the people's prince, that makes the later scandals so heartbreaking. Because the higher you climb, the further you fall. When the allegations of fraud finally surfaced, it wasn't just about missing millions. It was about betrayal of trust, the shattering of an image people had clung to for hope. Veterans who had once called Harry their brother now wondered if he had abandoned them. Families who had believed in him felt deceived, and the man who had built his identity on being one of them was suddenly accused of turning his back for profit. The irony is almost unbearable. The very thing that had made Harry great, his connection to veterans, became the foundation of the scandal that destroyed him. Without Invictus, there would have been no stage for his rise, but also no mechanism for his fall. It is this duality, this tragic twist, that sets his story apart from every other royal scandal in history. By the time the courtroom doors opened and the gavel echoed its devastating verdict, the memories of Harry cheering in the stands of Invictus felt like ghosts from another life. The rise of the people's prince had been dazzling, emotional, unforgettable, but it also set the stage for the betrayal that would come, making the fall all the more devastating. And as the world looked back at the photographs of Harry in uniform, arm around a wounded soldier, tears streaming down his face as the games unfolded, they could not help but ask, when did the dream die? Was it ever pure? Or was the seed of downfall planted even in those moments of triumph, hidden beneath the applause, waiting to bloom? When Meghan Markle walked into Harry's life, it was as if a new chapter of the prince's story was written overnight, one that shifted his trajectory from a soldier-turned-humanitarian into a global celebrity whose every move would be scrutinized under a new kind of spotlight. Before Meghan, Harry's identity was firmly rooted in his military service and the Invictus Games. He was known for his connection to veterans, his authenticity, and his willingness to embrace the role of the outsider within the royal family. But Meghan brought with her not only romance and companionship, but also a new set of influences, ambitions, and a worldview shaped not by monarchy or military, but by Hollywood and business. The combination was electric and, as history would show, explosive. From the very beginning, Meghan was unlike anyone the royal family had ever fully embraced. An American actress, biracial, divorced, outspoken, and unapologetically ambitious, she was both a breath of fresh air and a source of tension within the centuries-old institution of royalty. Harry was captivated. Here was a woman who understood the pressures of fame, who seemed to share his resentment of the press, and who offered him something the monarchy never had: a sense of agency, of carving out his own path on his own terms. In Meghan, Harry saw not just a partner, but a partner in rebellion. And together, they would push boundaries that few royals had dared to touch. But while their romance was initially celebrated in a fairy tale glow, it wasn't long before Meghan's influence began to seep into Harry's professional and philanthropic ventures. Observers noticed subtle shifts in the way Harry spoke, the way he positioned himself, the way he approached his role as a global figure. Where once he had been casual and soldierly, now his language took on the polished sheen of Hollywood branding. Interviews became more scripted, appearances more calculated. Meghan's touch was unmistakable. She had built a career in an industry where image was everything, and she applied those lessons to Harry with precision. The Invictus Games, once a raw expression of Harry's bond with veterans, began to take on a new layer of glamour. Celebrities who had barely glanced at the games before now attended, sitting in VIP boxes and posing for photographs. Sponsors noticed the shift, too. With Meghan by Harry's side, the Games became not just a charity event, but a media spectacle. Glossy magazines that once covered fashion weeks now ran spreads about Invictus. Red carpet interviews were laced with mentions of the Games, often as much about Meghan's outfits as the veterans competing. For some, this was a positive. More exposure meant more funding, more attention, more global reach. But for others, especially those close to the original mission, it felt like the purity of Invictus was being diluted into another tool of celebrity culture. Behind the scenes, Meghan's influence on Harry's decision-making grew. Those who had once worked closely with him began to notice a difference. Harry, once fiercely protective of Invictus as a grassroots initiative, became more open to larger sponsorship deals, new partnerships, and financial structures that complicated the charity's once straightforward mission. Meghan, with her Hollywood experience, understood the language of investors, branding, and expansion. She pushed Harry to think bigger, to capitalize on opportunities, to turn goodwill into influence. To Meghan, this was savvy strategy. To Harry's longtime supporters, it was the beginning of a dangerous game. The transformation was visible not just in how Invictus operated, but in how Harry himself carried himself. He began to present less like a soldier and more like a celebrity. Photographers noticed his increasing comfort with staged moments, carefully curated to project the right image. Meghan had lived her life in front of cameras, and she taught Harry how to master them rather than resent them. The irony was palpable. Harry had once blamed the media for his mother's death and despised the scrutiny it placed on his life. Now, under Meghan's guidance, he was learning to weaponize that same scrutiny for power, funding, and global reach. And yet, for all the glamour and branding, there was also a shift in the financial landscape. Meghan's background was not just in acting, but in navigating Hollywood's ecosystem of agents, managers, and business deals. She knew how to build networks, how to maximize financial opportunities, and how to protect her image through careful partnerships. Harry, who had once kept a fairly simple approach to his charity, was now surrounded by consultants, advisors, and business contacts, many of whom came through Meghan's world. These connections were not inherently sinister, but they represented a new influence, one that prioritized deals, branding, and global expansion over the quiet integrity that had once defined Harry's work with veterans. Critics began to whisper. Was Invictus becoming less about veterans and more about Harry and Meghan? Were sponsorships being used to boost their profile as much as to support the wounded warriors? And, most importantly, were the financial structures of Invictus as transparent as they once were? For years, these questions remained under the surface, drowned out by the glamour of their appearances and the media storm that followed the couple wherever they went. But those whispers would later become the foundation of a much louder accusation that millions meant for veterans had been redirected into a shadowy network of accounts, some tied to Meghan's contacts. For Harry, none of this seemed alarming at the time. He was in love, he was thriving, and the world was watching. Meghan gave him a confidence he had never known, and together they seemed unstoppable. They were photographed at global summits, applauded on red carpets, praised for modernizing the monarchy. For Harry, this was liberation. For Meghan, it was validation. For the institution of the monarchy, however, it was disruption. And for the veterans whose lives depended on Invictus, it was the beginning of a dangerous shift in priorities. The clash between Harry's old world and his new one was perhaps best symbolized by the contrast between his military brothers and Meghan's Hollywood friends. On one side were the men and women who had bled and sacrificed on battlefields, who spoke the blunt, unvarnished language of soldiers. On the other were agents, producers, influencers, and brand managers, who spoke the polished language of image and opportunity. Harry straddled both worlds, but over time, the balance tilted. Veterans who once had direct access to him now found themselves navigating layers of advisors. The simplicity of their bond with Harry seemed to be replaced by the machinery of a global brand. Meghan's role in this cannot be understated. She was not a passive bystander in Harry's journey. She was a driving force. Her ambition was palpable, and her belief in Harry was fierce. She convinced him that he had been undervalued by his family, that he could create something greater outside the monarchy, that he could harness his global fame to redefine his identity. And to Harry, who had always felt like the spare, always in his brother's shadow, this was intoxicating. For the first time, someone was telling him he could be more than the royal he was born to be. He could be a global powerhouse on his own terms. But ambition has a way of blurring lines. What started as a push to modernize and expand Invictus soon spilled into larger financial ventures, partnerships that raised eyebrows, and financial arrangements that grew increasingly complex. Meghan's contacts, many of whom were used to the opaque world of Hollywood accounting, became intertwined with Harry's charitable world. Offshore accounts, shell companies, consulting fees. The kind of financial structures that had never touched Harry's life before now became commonplace. At the time, it seemed like harmless expansion. But years later, when investigators began tracing where the millions had gone, those very connections would become the smoking gun in a scandal that would destroy everything. It is easy to paint Meghan as the villain in hindsight, but the reality is more complicated. She was ambitious, yes, but she was also strategic. She believed she was helping Harry reach his full potential. She believed they could take Invictus global in ways the royal family never allowed. She believed their image could be used as a force for good and profit. But in pushing Harry into a world of big deals and shadowy financial networks, she opened doors that could not be closed. And Harry, blinded by love and loyalty, walked through them willingly. By the time the first cracks appeared, the whispers of mismanaged funds, the quiet concerns of auditors, the suspicious movement of money, it was too late. The infrastructure of Meghan's world had fused with Harry's, and separating the two was impossible. The man who once shared a beer with soldiers in the trenches was now signing off on deals that flowed through accounts he barely understood. And the woman who had once been hailed as his savior was now being painted as the architect of his downfall. The entrance of Meghan into Harry's story is often told as a love story, and in many ways, it was. But it was also a turning point, the moment when Harry's world of authenticity and service collided with Meghan's world of image and ambition. Together, they created something dazzling, a power couple that commanded global attention. But beneath the glitter, fault lines formed. And those fault lines would one day fracture under the weight of $30 million, leaving behind a story not of love and triumph, but of betrayal and ruin. When the Invictus Games first launched in London in 2014, few could have imagined how quickly it would grow into one of the most recognizable charitable events in the world. It began humbly enough, a passion project born of Harry's military service, a tribute to the resilience of wounded veterans, and a way to give those who had sacrificed everything a stage to prove they were far from broken. The early games had a rawness that felt authentic, unpolished, and deeply moving. Veterans in wheelchairs, scarred but determined, played basketball, rowed boats, sprinted on prosthetic legs. Crowds cheered, cameras flashed, and the world wept with admiration. At its core, Invictus was pure, a gathering of the broken to show they were unbreakable. But as with many noble ventures, success bred attention, and attention brought money. Within a few short years, Invictus was no longer just a sporting event for wounded veterans. It had become a global phenomenon. Sponsorships from corporations eager to align themselves with heroism and resilience poured in. Governments pledged millions to host the games in their countries, treating the event as both a moral duty and a public relations coup. Broadcasters negotiated rights, eager to capture the tearful stories and triumphant moments that guaranteed ratings gold. By its third iteration, the Invictus Games had become not only a sporting event but a lucrative brand, one with the power to attract millions of dollars in revenue. For Harry, this transformation was at first a point of pride. Here was proof that his vision had touched the world. Each new host city meant larger audiences, more veterans supported, and greater awareness of the struggles servicemen and women faced. But alongside the applause came something else, the allure of influence. With every handshake from a CEO, every deal signed with a sponsor, and every government check deposited, Invictus shifted ever so slightly away from its original mission and toward the mechanics of big business. What had begun as a torch of hope was becoming a gold mine, and gold mines are rarely left untouched by greed. The expansion of Invictus changed everything. No longer could it be managed with a small, passionate team of staff and volunteers. It required accountants, lawyers, event planners, marketing strategists, public relations experts, and global consultants. The infrastructure ballooned. Budgets grew. And with each layer of complexity, the financial structures became more difficult to track, more open to manipulation. Funds moved through multiple hands, from governments to organizing committees to corporate sponsors to contractors, before they ever reached the athletes or their programs. For veterans and their families, this complexity was invisible. They only saw the games themselves. But behind the scenes, the lines between charity and commerce blurred, and where there are blurred lines, shadows follow. It was during this period of expansion that Meghan's influence became even more pronounced. She understood branding and global reach in a way Harry never had. She saw Invictus not only as a charitable project, but as a platform, one that could elevate Harry, and by extension herself, onto the world stage in a way the monarchy never allowed. With her guidance, Invictus began to adopt the sheen of a Hollywood production. Glitzy opening ceremonies were staged with A-list performances. Celebrities who had no connection to the military suddenly found themselves seated in prime spots at events. Sponsorship packages began to resemble marketing deals, with corporations gaining not just exposure but association with Harry and Meghan themselves. Invictus was no longer just about veterans. It was about branding resilience as a product. And Harry was the face on the packaging. The money reflected this shift. Corporations paid millions for sponsorship rights. Governments invested even more, eager to host an event that painted them as supporters of wounded warriors. Merchandise sales, broadcast deals, licensing fees, every aspect of Invictus began to generate revenue streams that rivaled those of major sporting events. What had begun as a modest event with heartfelt stories had turned into a global franchise. And with global franchises come global fortunes. For Harry, this flood of money was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it allowed the games to grow beyond what he ever dreamed. More veterans could be supported, more programs funded, more lives touched. On the other, it introduced him to a world of financial complexity he was ill-equipped to navigate. Harry was a soldier, not a businessman. He trusted those around him, advisors, consultants, and eventually Meghan, to handle the details. But in doing so, he ceded control of the very project that bore his name, leaving himself vulnerable to decisions he barely understood. This was the moment when Invictus shifted from being Harry's passion to being a machine, one powered by money, influence, and networks far beyond his comprehension. With Meghan at his side, doors to corporate boardrooms and Hollywood connections opened wide. Companies saw Invictus not just as charity, but as an investment in goodwill, a way to polish their reputations while benefiting from the glamour of Harry and Meghan's global brand. The veterans were still there, still competing, still inspiring. But increasingly, they were the backdrop to a spectacle that revolved around the Sussexes themselves. And with the rise of money came the inevitable questions. Where exactly were the millions going? How much was being spent on athletes? And how much on production, travel, consultants, and celebrity appearances? The early days of Invictus had been marked by transparency. Donations went directly to programs veterans could see and feel. But as the event scaled, the money began to flow through complex pipelines. Funds were routed through contractors and third parties, invoices stacked high, and accountability became murkier. Insiders whispered about payments that didn't add up, inflated expenses, and suspicious transfers. But with the games riding high on success and Harry's image untouchable, few dared to dig too deeply. The public, meanwhile, saw only the surface. The roar of the crowds, the tears of veterans, the beaming smiles of Harry and Meghan. The optics were perfect. Politicians basked in the glow of association, sponsors flaunted their involvement, and the press produced glossy spreads about resilience and hope. But behind the curtain, the transformation was undeniable. Invictus had become big business, and with big business comes big temptation. It is important to remember that at this stage, Harry was not yet accused of fraud. There were no headlines of betrayal, no investigations underway. What there was, however, was a quiet shift in perception. To some veterans, Harry no longer seemed as accessible as before. The man who once shared beers with them after events now mingled with billionaires and celebrities. The focus seemed less on their struggles and more on the grandeur of the event. And while they were grateful for the platform, some began to wonder, who was Invictus really for? This was not sloppy charity management. This was sophisticated fraud, the kind more often associated with international corporations or organized crime. For investigators, the question was no longer whether money had been misused, but who had orchestrated it. Was Meghan the mastermind, leveraging her Hollywood and business connections to create the network? Was Harry complicit, turning a blind eye while enjoying the luxuries it afforded? Or was Harry simply a useful front, his name shielding the network from suspicion until it was too late? The public, once these allegations surfaced, was merciless. Headlines screamed betrayal. Talk shows dissected Meghan's past, searching for signs of ambition or ruthlessness that might explain her alleged role. Old acquaintances came forward, describing her as driven, calculating, and always focused on climbing higher. Critics painted her as a manipulator who had ensnared Harry into a world of fraud and scandal. Supporters countered, calling the allegations a witch hunt, a convenient narrative for those who had always wanted to discredit her. The debate was fierce, emotional, and polarizing. But at the center of it all were the veterans, men and women who had sacrificed everything, now left to wonder if they had been used as pawns in a scheme to enrich those at the top. Harry's position during this time became increasingly tragic. He had built Invictus as his legacy, his redemption, his connection to the people. Now, that very legacy was being dismantled piece by piece, tied to allegations of fraud he either could not control or did not want to admit. His loyalty to Meghan was fierce, but it came at a cost. Defending her meant standing against the evidence, against the voices of betrayed veterans, against the growing mountain of financial records that suggested something deeply corrupt had taken root in the heart of his beloved project. Every time Harry defended Meghan publicly, every time he dismissed concerns as attacks, he tied himself more tightly to the scandal. By the time investigators formally connected the shell companies to Meghan's associates, Harry's name was inextricably linked to the fraud. The tragedy of the alleged shell company network is not just in the money lost, but in what it symbolized. Invictus was supposed to be a beacon of hope, proof that resilience could triumph over tragedy. Instead, it became a case study in how good intentions can be corrupted by greed and ambition. The veterans who once stood proudly at Harry's side now felt abandoned. The donors who gave millions in good faith now felt swindled. And the public, who had once cheered for the People's Prince and his fairy tale romance, now watched in horror as the story twisted into something darker. When prosecutors finally presented their evidence in court, the picture was damning. Charts and documents showed millions moving through companies that had no offices, no staff, and no services. Witnesses testified to the irregularities, auditors recounted their ignored warnings, and experts explained the mechanisms of offshore fraud in painstaking detail. And time and again, the names on those companies led back to Meghan's acquaintances, her networks, her world. The defense tried to argue that Meghan herself had no direct involvement, that she was being smeared by association. But the prosecution didn't need to prove she signed the checks. They only needed to show that the network existed, that the money was missing, and that Harry, as the figurehead of Invictus, bore responsibility. The image of Harry sitting in court as these revelations were laid out is one that haunted observers. His face, once so open and expressive, grew harder, paler, more strained with each passing day. He shifted in his seat, clenched his jaw, sometimes glanced at Meghan with what seemed like a mixture of love and desperation. For a man who had once built his entire identity around loyalty, to his comrades, to his mother's legacy, to his wife, the conflict was unbearable. Did he believe Meghan was innocent? Did he know more than he let on? Or was he simply unwilling to let go of the woman who had reshaped his life? The answers may never be known. But what was undeniable was that the web of shell companies became the centerpiece of the scandal, the symbol of betrayal that shattered Harry's legacy and condemned him to the fate he never saw coming. The alleged web of shell companies was more than financial fraud. It was the mechanism through which trust was stolen, veterans were betrayed, and a prince's reputation was destroyed. It was the machinery of ambition gone too far, hidden in offshore accounts and paper companies, now laid bare for the world to see. And as the courtroom drama unfolded, one truth became clear: whether Meghan had built the web herself, or whether she had simply become entangled in it, it would forever define the scandal. And through it, Harry would carry the burden of being the face of a betrayal that began with love, grew through ambition, and ended in ruin. The moment the legal papers arrived at Harry's residence, a weight unlike any battlefield armor settled over him. There was no sound of gunfire, no whiplash of explosions, no adrenaline surge that could be relied upon to steal him. Instead, there was the quiet, ominous thud of documents sliding across the polished floor, delivered with the cold precision of bureaucracy. The letters bore the insignia of one of the most formidable law firms in London, their envelopes embossed in gold lettering that suggested authority, permanence, and inevitable confrontation. Harry, used to command in crisis, now faced a different kind of war. A war defined by contracts, litigation, and the meticulous dissection of every decision he had ever made in connection with the Invictus Games. He opened the first envelope, and his eyes immediately scanned the detailed allegations. The accusations were precise, deliberate, and damning: mismanagement of funds, breach of fiduciary duty, failure to report financial irregularities, and negligence in oversight. The language was cold and unyielding, leaving little room for interpretation or defense. Each paragraph was meticulously constructed to erode his credibility, and each point seemed designed to strike at his integrity, his reputation, and his legacy. Even the legal jargon, which would normally serve as a barrier between truth and consequence, offered no comfort. Instead, it read like a calculated narrative of culpability, prepared to be wielded against him in court, in public, and in the court of global opinion. For a man who had spent years serving on the front lines, whose days had been filled with life-or-death decisions, this was a battlefield of a different kind. No physical strength could counteract the meticulous scrutiny, no courage could shield him from the relentless examination of contracts, financial statements, and correspondence. Every action, every choice, every signature became a potential weapon in the hands of those who sought accountability or, in some cases, public spectacle. The law, impartial and precise, could be merciless, and Harry suddenly felt the vulnerability of even the most public and powerful life. The knowledge that a single misstep, real or perceived, could unravel decades of service, goodwill, and personal sacrifice. The legal team supporting Harry was formidable, a coalition of top-tier attorneys who had navigated high-profile cases across continents. Yet even their confidence could not mask the scale of the challenge. Each document required careful parsing. Each accusation necessitated evidence, testimony, and context. It became immediately clear that the legal battle would be protracted, consuming months of preparation, strategy, and negotiation. For Harry, it was a paradox. He was no stranger to risk, but this was a realm where the rules were arcane, the consequences public, and the margins for error minuscule. As the first lawsuits were filed, media coverage intensified. News outlets, already aware of the scandal, now had the tangible framework of court proceedings to analyze. Headlines shifted from speculative commentary to declarative statements. Prince Harry faces legal action over Invictus funds. Royal scandal escalates into courtroom drama. Will the prince survive the legal siege? Each story dissected the filings, extracted quotes from legal experts, and speculated on potential outcomes. Social media, unrestrained and instantaneous, magnified the drama, turning every headline into viral content, every tweet into public judgment. Harry, who had once managed the gaze of the public with careful diplomacy, now felt it as an unrelenting force pressing in from all sides. The first court appearances were a revelation. The courtroom, with its austere walls, polished benches, and imposing judiciary, contrasted sharply with the chaos of public scrutiny. Here, the battle was not waged in sound bites or viral posts, but in facts, procedures, and the meticulous presentation of evidence. Witnesses were called, documents examined, and arguments presented with rigorous adherence to protocol. Harry, standing in a suit tailored to the formality of the occasion, felt the pressure of every eye, not just those in the room, but the countless millions observing from afar. The courtroom became a stage, the legal team's performers, and Harry, unwillingly, both protagonist and defendant in a narrative that the world consumed voraciously. The opposing legal team was relentless. They had spent weeks preparing cross-examinations, scrutinizing every transaction, every email, and every board meeting of the Invictus Games. Their strategy was precise: establish a pattern of negligence, highlight lapses in oversight, and demonstrate that the prince's involvement, whether direct or indirect, had tangible consequences. They called on financial experts, auditors, and former colleagues, each providing testimony that slowly constructed a narrative of mismanagement. The presentation was clinical, methodical, and unyielding, leaving Harry's defense team to respond in kind, carefully countering each point, contextualizing each action, and meticulously reconstructing the timeline of decisions. Outside the courtroom, the world reacted in real time. News outlets provided live coverage, analyzing the legal proceedings moment by moment. Social media users speculated on the implications, creating threads, memes, and discussion groups dedicated solely to the unfolding drama. Public opinion became a second, informal trial. Every gesture, every expression, and every word Harry uttered in court was dissected, interpreted, and debated. The lines between legal proceedings and media spectacle blurred, creating a dual pressure that few could endure. Harry, once accustomed to public scrutiny, now faced the combined weight of law, media, and global judgment. The emotional toll was staggering. Harry found himself navigating a landscape of anxiety, stress, and isolation. Sleep became elusive, and each night was punctuated by the haunting replay of court arguments, media coverage, and social media commentary. Conversations with Meghan were careful and measured, each exchange weighed against the potential for misinterpretation or exploitation. Friends and advisors provided support, but even the closest allies were limited in their ability to shield him from the relentless scrutiny. It was a siege not of walls or bullets, but of attention, expectation, and relentless evaluation. The legal siege also exposed fractures within the broader network of supporters and associates. Some distanced themselves, uncertain how to navigate their own reputations amid the scandal. Others remained loyal but cautious, offering advice without public endorsement. Harry realized that even the most steadfast relationships were vulnerable to the pressures of public opinion and legal implication. Trust became a fragile commodity, carefully rationed, and every decision required calculation not just for legal outcome, but for personal consequence. Amid the mounting pressure, a turning point emerged. Investigative journalists, initially skeptical or sensationalist, began uncovering corroborating evidence that supported Harry's defense. Leaked documents, verified statements, and expert analyses revealed complexities that the initial allegations had overlooked or misrepresented. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. What had seemed an open and shut case of negligence evolved into a nuanced examination of organizational oversight, miscommunication, and the challenges inherent in running a global initiative with multiple stakeholders. The legal strategy pivoted, emphasizing context, intent, and systemic issues rather than mere personal fault. Yet the path forward was treacherous. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every legal maneuver became fodder for public interpretation. Courts, while focused on facts, existed within a media ecosystem that transformed proceedings into spectacle. Harry understood that even a legal victory might not fully repair the damage inflicted by weeks of intense scrutiny. Reputation, once tarnished in the public eye, could be slow to heal, and every interaction, interview, or public statement carried the potential to either restore confidence or reignite controversy. In this crucible, Harry's resilience was tested in ways that were profoundly personal. The legal siege demanded not only strategic thinking and legal acumen, but also emotional fortitude. It required patience in the face of provocation, clarity amid confusion, and composure under relentless observation. Each day, the stakes increased. Each motion filed or argued shaped the future of the Invictus Games, and each decision had repercussions that extended far beyond the courtroom. The siege was not a single battle but an ongoing campaign, a test of character, endurance, and the ability to navigate adversity on a stage watched by millions. By the close of the first month of proceedings, it was evident that the legal siege would define the narrative of Harry's public life for years to come. It was a war fought with words, documents, and witnesses, yet it carried consequences as profound as any battlefield engagement. Friends, allies, and advisors continued to rally, yet the sense of isolation persisted, a reminder that even the most protected and powerful individuals were vulnerable when the machinery of law and media combined. The prince who had once been lauded for courage now needed the same bravery to endure scrutiny, skepticism, and the painstaking march of legal process. Through it all, one truth became clear. The legal siege was not merely about the Invictus Games, about money, or about organizational failure. It was about legacy, honor, and the preservation of integrity in the face of overwhelming pressure. Every document, every courtroom appearance, and every public perception played into the larger story of who Harry was, what he represented, and how he would navigate the most formidable challenge of his life beyond war, beyond charity, and beyond the public gaze. The outcome remained uncertain, but the resolve with which he approached each day, each motion, and each strategic decision would shape not only the immediate battle, but the enduring perception of a prince tested by circumstance, adversity, and a world unwilling to forget. The answer, in hindsight, is complicated. It was still for the veterans. They still competed, still healed, still found purpose through the games. But it was also increasingly for the sponsors, the governments, the Sussexes. Invictus was becoming a multifaceted enterprise, serving multiple masters, and in that environment, the seeds of its eventual scandal were sown. The veterans were still the heart, but they were no longer the whole. They had become part of a larger picture, one where money and power played roles as significant as resilience and hope. This chapter of the story, the transformation of Invictus into a gold mine, is critical because it illustrates how good intentions can be swallowed by success. Harry's vision had been pure, born of genuine connection and service. But once millions entered the equation, the project was no longer just his. It belonged to investors, sponsors, governments, and advisors. And within that complexity, cracks formed. Money began to move in ways that were hard to trace, and with Meghan's Hollywood-style approach to branding and expansion, those cracks widened into dangerous fault lines. What is perhaps most tragic is that none of this was inevitable. If Invictus had remained smaller, more grassroots, more focused on the veterans than the spectacle, it might have continued without controversy. But Harry's desire to prove himself, Meghan's ambition to expand their influence, and the world's appetite for celebrity-driven charity combined to create something too big, too fast, too vulnerable. And when investigators later uncovered the shell companies, the offshore accounts, the missing millions, it was not difficult to see how such a thing could happen in an enterprise that had grown so large, so fast, and so unaccountable. The Invictus dream becoming a gold mine is not just the story of a charity's growth. It is the story of a transformation. From purity to complexity, from simplicity to spectacle, from service to business. It is the story of how success, when not carefully managed, can open doors not just to glory but to greed. And it is the story of how Harry, once the soldier among soldiers, became the figurehead of a global enterprise he could no longer fully control. In the beginning, Invictus had been about hope. But as the gold mine grew, hope became entangled with money, and money has a way of leaving shadows. Shadows that would eventually swallow Harry whole. Every scandal begins with whispers. Long before headlines screamed fraud and courts handed down sentences, there were murmurs in quiet corners, subtle signs that something about the Invictus Games' finances didn't add up. At first, these whispers were brushed aside, drowned out by the thunderous applause of crowds, the emotional testimonies of veterans, and the powerful image of Prince Harry at the center of it all. But red flags have a way of demanding attention, and the first signs of trouble began to emerge in ways too subtle to ignore, then too obvious to conceal. It started with the numbers. In the early days, budgets for the games were simple. Donations came in, and they went directly to programs. Travel for veterans, rehabilitation support, equipment, event logistics. But as the games grew, so too did the budgets, tens of millions from governments, corporations, and private donors. Auditors began to notice discrepancies. Large sums routed through accounts that didn't match the descriptions, inflated invoices for services, and expenses that seemed wildly out of proportion. At first, these were explained away as the growing pains of a young organization scaling too quickly. Harry's defenders assured everyone that the heart of Invictus remained pure, even if the paperwork lagged behind. But behind the scenes, staff members began to voice concerns. Some noticed that funds earmarked for specific veteran programs seemed to vanish into administrative costs. Others saw contracts awarded to companies with no track record of providing the services they billed for. There were murmurs of shell organizations, consulting firms that appeared overnight and disappeared just as quickly, all while millions flowed through their accounts. Those who questioned these practices often found themselves sidelined, reassigned, or quietly encouraged to move on. The culture of silence that often surrounds royalty extended itself into Invictus, cloaking suspicion under a veil of loyalty and fear. One early red flag came from the veterans themselves. Some began to notice delays in promised funding for rehabilitation programs. A veteran who had been promised financial assistance for prosthetic upgrades found the money delayed for months, only to be told it had been rerouted through administrative processes. Families of fallen soldiers who had been assured of support claimed the money they were promised never materialized. These stories rarely made the news at the time. Who would dare accuse Prince Harry of betraying the very people he claimed to champion? But in private, frustrations grew, and trust began to fray. It wasn't just veterans who noticed. Journalists covering the games began to stumble upon anomalies. Some reporters requested detailed breakdowns of where the money was going and were met with evasive answers or heavily redacted reports. Others noticed that while Harry and Meghan's travel and accommodations for events grew increasingly lavish, the veterans themselves often stayed in budget facilities. On one occasion, headlines quietly questioned why a luxury villa had been rented for Harry and Meghan during a Games event while athletes stayed in dormitories. The story was quickly buried under more flattering coverage, but it was an early glimpse of a troubling pattern. The money was not always where it was supposed to be. Then came the sponsors. Corporations that had pledged millions to support the Games began asking for accountability. One company, after donating a large sum, requested a detailed report of how their funds were spent, only to discover vague line items that raised more questions than answers. Another sponsor threatened to withdraw entirely unless more transparency was provided. These confrontations rarely reached the public, but they rattled those on the inside. The golden glow of Invictus was beginning to tarnish, and those who knew the truth were growing uneasy. For Harry, the red flags were both obvious and invisible. He was the face of the Games, the man whose name was on every press release, but he was not the one handling the books. Advisors assured him everything was fine, that these discrepancies were normal for an organization of such scale. Meghan, with her Hollywood-honed instincts for controlling narratives, insisted that the focus remain on the veterans and the spectacle, not the behind-the-scenes details. Harry, trusting both his team and his wife, allowed the concerns to be minimized. But every time a question was ignored, every time a whistle was silenced, the cracks grew wider. One of the most telling early warnings came from a small group of auditors hired to review the financials before the Toronto Games in 2017. They flagged several transactions routed through shell companies with no clear services provided. These entities had connections to individuals in Meghan's wider network, Hollywood acquaintances, business contacts, and former associates. The auditors raised the alarm, recommending a deeper investigation. But their concerns were brushed aside. The report filed away under confidential, and the Games went on, brighter and bigger than ever. To the public, the Toronto Games were a triumph. Behind closed doors, however, they marked the point at which silence became complicity. What made these red flags so insidious was the way they were obscured by Harry's image. He was untouchable. The world wanted to believe in him, to see him as the soldier prince who stood by his comrades. Journalists hesitated to push too hard, fearing backlash from both the palace and the public. Sponsors bit their tongues, reluctant to be seen as criticizing a project for wounded veterans. Even governments turned a blind eye, choosing the prestige of hosting the Games over uncomfortable questions. In this atmosphere, red flags were not just ignored, they were actively buried. And yet, the whispers kept growing louder. One staff member who later became a whistleblower described it as a slow-motion betrayal. She recalled the moment she realized that money earmarked for mental health programs for veterans had been funneled into a consulting firm that vanished weeks later. "We were told not to ask questions," she said. "But how could you not, when you knew soldiers were suffering while millions were disappearing?" Stories like hers painted a haunting picture. People who saw the truth but felt powerless to stop it. The veterans themselves became the most heartbreaking indicators of the betrayal. They began sharing quiet frustrations among themselves, of delayed funding, of promises not kept, of feeling like props in a spectacle that no longer prioritized them. For many, Harry remained a figure of hope, but doubts crept in. Was he truly unaware of what was happening, or was he turning a blind eye? That question lingered in their hearts, unspoken but heavy, and it would later explode into fury when the full truth came out. By the time the Sydney Games were announced, the financial discrepancies had grown too large for whispers alone. Millions were moving in directions no one could fully trace, and Meghan's name began appearing more frequently in connection with the accounts. For some, this was the moment the red flags became undeniable. For others, it was still just noise in the background of a dazzling spectacle. But for investigators who would later unravel the scandal, these early warning signs became the first threads of a web that would eventually ensnare both Harry and Meghan. The tragedy of the first red flags is not just that they existed, but that they were ignored. If someone had acted sooner, if Harry had insisted on transparency, if sponsors had demanded accountability, the scandal might have been stopped before it destroyed everything. Instead, the culture of silence, loyalty, and denial allowed the cracks to widen until they split open into an abyss. The veterans, the very people Invictus was meant to serve, became the silent casualties of this negligence. Their trust was the first thing stolen, long before the courts declared millions had been siphoned away. Looking back, these early warning signs read like a prophecy. The inflated invoices, the missing funds, the shell companies, the silent staff, they were all markers of what was to come. But at the time, they were brushed aside as minor concerns, as distractions from the bigger mission. It is only in hindsight that they appear as flashing red lights, ignored until they burned everything down. This is the tragedy of Chapter 4, the moment when betrayal could still have been prevented, when Harry could have chosen to dig deeper, when Meghan could have drawn a line between ambition and greed, when sponsors and governments could have demanded accountability. Instead, the warnings were ignored, the whispers buried, and the stage set for the scandal that would ultimately consume them all. The deeper investigators dug into the Invictus Games financial records, the clearer it became that the missing millions hadn't simply evaporated into sloppy bookkeeping or innocent administrative errors. There was a pattern. Money that was supposed to go directly to programs for wounded veterans was being routed through obscure, hard-to-trace organizations. These weren't established firms with offices, staff, or reputations. Many existed only on paper. They had vague names, addresses in tax havens, and bank accounts that opened and closed with dizzying speed. To investigators, the pattern was unmistakable: shell companies, designed to conceal the movement of money. And at the heart of many of these companies, the threads led back, directly or indirectly, to Meghan Markle's world. It began with small discoveries. A payment for event management, listed at an exorbitant sum, was traced to a firm registered in the Cayman Islands. On paper, the firm claimed to provide consulting services for international events. In reality, investigators found no employees, no website, and no evidence of actual work performed. Another payment, supposedly for public relations and media outreach, went to a company in Panama that dissolved within a year of receiving the funds. Again, no evidence of real activity existed beyond the paper trail. What tied these mysterious firms together was not their function, but their connections. The directors listed were often people who had, in some way, crossed paths with Meghan in Hollywood or her broader network of business acquaintances. At first, this seemed almost too convenient to be true. Could Meghan really be connected to a web of shell companies? Or were investigators simply finding coincidences in the overlapping circles of wealthy elites? But the more they pulled at the threads, the more undeniable the links became. A Los Angeles-based associate of Meghan's former talent agency, appeared as a co-director of one company registered in Belize. A fashion industry contact she had once worked with on a charity project was listed on the board of another company in the British Virgin Islands. An old friend from her pre-royal days was tied to a consultancy in Malta that received suspiciously large transfers. Individually, none of these connections were damning. But together, they painted a picture that was difficult to dismiss. This wasn't random. The pattern suggested an intentional network, created not to operate legitimate businesses, but to siphon funds, launder them through multiple jurisdictions, and make tracing them nearly impossible. For investigators, it was a classic blueprint of financial fraud. For the public, when these details began to leak, it was a shocking narrative. The Duchess of Sussex, once hailed as a modernizer of the monarchy, was now being accused of running, or at least benefiting from, a labyrinth of offshore companies designed to divert millions away from wounded veterans. The emotional weight of these revelations cannot be overstated. To learn that funds meant for prosthetics, rehabilitation programs, and mental health support for veterans had instead been funneled through a network of shell companies allegedly tied to Meghan's contacts was devastating. Veterans who had once stood proudly beside Harry and Meghan felt betrayed. "We thought she cared," one veteran told reporters later. "We thought she was one of us, standing up for us. To hear that money we needed was disappearing into offshore accounts, it broke something in us." These weren't abstract losses. Every dollar diverted meant one less prosthetic, one less therapy session, one less family supported. The betrayal was personal. Meghan's defenders argued fiercely that the links were circumstantial. They pointed out that wealthy individuals often had overlapping networks in finance and business, and that simply knowing someone listed on a company did not prove involvement. They claimed Meghan was being scapegoated because of her outsider status in the royal family, her gender, her race, and her ambition. To some degree, this argument resonated, especially among those who had long believed Meghan was unfairly targeted by the British establishment. But for others, the paper trail spoke louder than any defense. When multiple companies tied to her acquaintances received millions in Invictus funds only to dissolve shortly after, the narrative of coincidence became harder to sustain. The mechanics of how the money moved were chilling in their simplicity. A sponsor would donate a large sum to Invictus. From there, instead of going directly to athlete programs, a portion would be allocated to consulting services or event logistics. These contracts were awarded to companies that often existed only on paper. The companies would receive the funds, move them through multiple accounts in different countries, and eventually dissolve. By the time investigators tried to follow the trail, the money had been split, transferred, and buried under layers of offshore secrecy. What remained was a ghostly trail pointing back to people who, in one way or another, were linked to Meghan's world.